Welcome to the Writers League of Texas podcast, conversations and presentations featuring writers and industry professionals talking about the craft and business of writing. More information about this discussion, including details on our panelists and presenters, can be found at writersleague.org. We hope you enjoy the discussion.
Thank you so much for coming tonight. Tonight's topic is how to find the drama and historical details. We're talking about historical novels, historical narrative nonfiction. And you know, we've all, you're here because you're interested in that genre, and so you automatically find it interesting. But I remember an experience I had in college when I was in some history class. I don't remember what it was, and one of the books that was assigned was Life in a Medieval Village, and I was really excited. I was like, oh, this is going to be great. I'm going to find out what it was like to be a serf and to be a lord and knight, and it was so just mind-numbingly boring because it was a history book, and it wasn't and there was no narrative to it. It was just like facts and figures, how many cows people had, and so on. and it was interesting if you're a scholar, but it was not interesting to me, and because there was no narrative, there was no drama. And so you can have the historical details and zero drama, and what good writers do if they're writing narrative is they find like narrative there, and they turn those details into like things that are interesting. And so that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So I'm going to start by introducing our panelists. To my left is USA Today bestselling author Sherry Thomas. She decided years ago that her goal in life is to write every kind of book she enjoys reading. Thus far, she has published romance, fantasy, mystery, and wuxia-inspired duology. Her books regularly receive starred reviews and Best of the Year honors from trade publications, including such outlets as the New York Times and National Public Radio. She is also a two-time winner of Romance Writer of America's prestigious Rita Award. Her latest book, A Conspiracy in Belgravia, is the second entry in the gender-bending Lady Sherlock historical mystery series. A Study in Scarlet Woman, Book 1 of the series, was an NPR and Kirkus Review's Best Book of 2016. Please welcome Sherry. Natalia Sylvester is the author of Chasing the Sun and the forthcoming Everyone You Know Goes Home. She was born in Lima, Peru, and came to the U.S. at age 4, and as a child she spent time in South Florida, Central Florida, and the Rio Grande Valley in Texas before her family set roots once again in Miami. A former magazine editor, Natalia now works as a freelance writer in Texas and is a faculty member of the low-res MFA program at Regis University. Her articles have appeared in Latina Magazine, Writer's Digest, The Austin American Statesman, and NBCLatino.com. Chasing the Sun was named the best debut book of 2014 by Latinidad and was chosen as a Book of the Month by the National Latino Book Club. Please welcome Natalia. Dan Oppenheimer is the author of Exit Right, The People Who Left the Left and Reshaped the American Century. His articles and videos have been featured in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Tablet Magazine, and Salon.com. He has an MFA in nonfiction writing from Columbia University and is a director of strategic communications at the University of Texas at Austin. Please welcome Dan. And finally, James L. Haley is an award-winning historian and author of numerous books on Texas and Western history, as well as several works of fiction, including The Buffalo War, which has been in print for 39 years and remains the definitive history of the final war of the Comanche, Kiowa, and Cheyenne Indians against Anglo domination. I look good for my age. He's also the author of the multiple award-winning biographies Sam Houston and Wolfe, The Lives of Jack London. His work has garnered many awards, including 2 Spur Awards from the Western Writers of America. His latest novel and the second in the Putnam Naval Adventure series is A Darker Sea, Master Commandant Putnam and the War of 1812. Please welcome James Haley. So our writers tonight come from they're all writing historical narratives, but it's a wide variety of kinds of history and time periods. And so I thought we would begin just briefly. Tell us about either your most recent book or the book that you have coming out shortly. Tell us what's the time period and kind of just in a nutshell, what's the story at the heart of it? Sherry, do you want to begin?
Yeah, mine is easy. Mine is a gender-bending Sherlock Holmes mystery, and it takes place when Sherlock Holmes books do in the late Victorian era.
So, Chasing the Sun is my first book, and it takes place in 1992, Lima, Peru. And I was also kind of trying to retrace a lot of family history as well while I was writing it. And then my next book, Everyone Knows You Go Home, kind of spans the period from the 80s in McAllen to the present.
And, you know, it's funny because you go from like Victorian times to like the 80s and 90s, and like, you know, for those of us who were alive then, like it doesn't seem like history, but if you've taught any like college students, they're always like, whoa, or like I have kids, and they're like, wow, that was so long ago, what was it like?
Yeah, I didn't really know, like I never really like knew I was writing, you know, historical, and I don't know that if it would classify or not, but I kind of, like I realized, I'm like, oh yeah, it's history, you know, and so, recent history, but.
Dan?
So my book, which came out last year, is Exit Right. It's about 6 people who went from the left to the right of the political spectrum, prominent Americans or one naturalized American, and in a very rough, non-systematic way, it kind of travels throughout the 20th century. So it starts with the birth of the first subject in 1901, and then it ends kind of in the early 2000s.
And Jim?
I had done 2 historical novels, one set in Arizona in the 1870s and one set in British East Africa in the 1890s. 2 different, very different. And I wound up sort of backing into the tall ship adventure genre because there was a very smart editor at Putnam who noticed that all those series are British and they're all Napoleonic, whether it's C.S. Forrester's Hornblower or the Master and Commander series, all the ones now, they're all British. And she had contacted my agent and said, well, we'd like to do an American series, but we're not really sure that the American Navy's doing anything between like the War of 1812 and the Civil War. He said, hang on, I might have somebody. So I wound up getting a job to do this. 2 best buddies, Bond is 14-year-old midshipman during the Barbary Pirate War. That was the first book that came out a year ago. And then now our main character is a master commandant of the War of 1812. And by book 6, they will both be white-haired old commodores in the Civil War. So I kind of backed into it, and it's been quite a steep learning curve to catch up with what other people are doing. Because when you write, there's one thing we'll be talking about is when you write historical fiction, there are purists out there. If you get so much as a not wrong, they come for you.
You know, so I thought we would start, and Jim and Sherry, this might be a question for you. When we're talking about historical fiction as a genre, as a thing that people are going to go in search of, what does that mean? What makes it historical fiction as opposed to like a novel that's set in the past or a book that's set in the past? Is there something that marks it as a genre?
I am going to yield it to you because I write books set in the past.
But that's exactly what. I think it has probably more to do with creating a whole world that a reader can step into. And that's one thing that I've discovered is when I'm working, you're constantly being pulled back to the present by an anachronism alert. You know, in writing A Darker Sea, which was published 2 days ago, I was constantly, a character is writing with a pencil. Ding, ding, ding. Did they have pencils in 1812? Well, it turns out that the first American pencil was manufactured in Massachusetts in 1812. So I not only got to have him with a pencil, I get to do a whole little riff on it. Or they're casually eating pumpkin pie. Ding, ding, ding. Did they have pumpkin pie? And so when you get into this genre, I think the challenge is to create this whole environment that a reader can step into. And having done mostly history in my career, I find it's about 8 times harder than just writing about something.
Sherry, as someone who writes books set in the past, would you use that same sort of definition, or would you?
Yeah, because when I think of historical fiction, sometimes I wonder if they have to have real people in them, like characters based on real people, like Philippa Gregory or Jean Plaidy, those kind of books, like real life characters turn into fiction. So I'm not sure whether that's one definition of historical fiction, but what I've always written has been stories set in the past, not necessarily featuring anyone you've ever heard of, but just stories set in the past. And I do totally agree with you in the sense that I look up every noun, basically. I look up every noun.
Yep.
And every noun I don't look up is something waiting to stab me in the back.
Yes, yes.
And I find it's very, very dangerous to make assumptions about the past.
Yep.
Sometimes you think, these people sure as hell didn't have this, and they did. And sometimes you think, yes, you definitely had this because you're pretty advanced in other things, and no, they didn't. You know, I learned the hard way with helium. I had a helium balloon in a book set in the 1890s.
Oops.
And they had isolated so many gases by then that I thought, surely they had helium because they had isolated oxygen. And I thought that would be a harder thing because it's combustible. But no, I did not look up helium, and they did not have helium.
So did someone point that out to you afterward?
Someone pointed that out to me. One person pointed that out to me while saying they enjoyed the book very well, so they were not like going to hand me in the streets. So,
Michael, can I ask questions, or am I only
Yes,
allowed
absolutely.
to answer them? Because I have nothing novel to say about writing historical fiction, having done none of it. Has the internet made your lives easier, writers of historical fiction, in terms of answering those questions?
I always say the only time I would consider a threesome
I think, yeah, you need a long pause here, right? Let them sit with that for a second, yeah.
is with the two founders of Google.
Amen, sister.
Because I came of age before Google Books. And that meant I used to have to drag, I took a library membership at the UT library, a public membership at the UT library, paying $40 a year, and I used to have to drag a suitcase there to take books home, to do my research. All that changed with the advent of Google Books and Google Maps. I mean, the thing about Google Maps is now you can look at remote areas that you have never been to and know exactly what they look like. And especially if those areas are like in, say, where Osama bin Laden used to hide, it hasn't changed in 120 years. So you can confidently say, that's what it looked like 120 years ago when you have a book set in 1897. So yes, it has changed everything. They haven't taken up on my offer. I don't know why.
Well, you know that Google is listening, so.
Yeah. so you may get an email or just a drone visitation.
We know
yeah.
there's tons of history on the internet. What we have to be careful of is that most of it's wrong.
Yeah.
Because
So
anybody can post anything out there.
So we're talking about research now, which is just an integral part of writing historical fiction. How do you, Jim, sort of negotiate like true and false history on the internet?
By going off the internet, basically. And I've discovered so many things. It really helps, and I've only discovered this recently, if you do travel, to actually do, because things can be on the internet and you can find these old resources and you think, oh, it hasn't changed. When I was writing Captive Paradise, I wanted to see where Captain Cook landed at Kealakekua Bay, and so it's a beach, so I wrote it as a beach. And I got there, and I discovered that it's a pebble beach. It's not a sand beach. And I thought, oh, now I understand. But in fact, it was very strange. It was about half broken up coral and about half broken up lava. And this whole beach was just as black and white as a chessboard. Never thought of that. Well, I thought, okay, now I've got it. No, actually that beach had been sand, but it was scoured out by Hurricane Iniki. So it's a combination of things. It's internet research, plus going there and seeing, plus talking to people. Yeah.
The good thing about Google Books is that for someone writing in the 19th century, you can go directly to primary material.
Yes.
You don't have to rely on what somebody's writing 50 years or 100 years later. You can go directly then to sources that people wrote literally for one of my books, I set it near the Battle of Malakand, which took place in the northwest frontier of the British Raj. And the source I used was actually written by Winston Churchill, who was 20 years old at that time and serving as a war reporter, war correspondent, sending back his stuff to either the Telegraph or the Dispatch, I can't quite remember. But then later he took all his reports and turned it into a book.
So primary material from somebody who was right there. That's the good thing about Google Books. When I found that book on Google Books, that's when I said, Google guys, I owe you.
Natalia, when you were researching for your first novel set in Peru, which is where you were from, but you left there at a very young age, and then the new one, which is set in sort of South Texas, what kinds of research, because these are places that you've been, but like what kinds of research did you do beyond sort of mining like family stories and things that you heard in talking to people?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it was, like, I think, like, with Chasing the Sun especially, it was a lot of reading. I watched a lot of documentaries. I mean, I traveled to Peru I think 2 or 3 times in the span of when I was writing. And I did, aside from interviewing family members, I also, like, interviewed people who, like, had similar jobs to some of my characters, who had maybe lived there at the time. Because I had a lot of memories from when I'd visited as a child, and but the time period I was writing in, like, I had already moved. Like, my family left in '88, and so suddenly '92. And in those 4 years, I mean, you go from basically in the beginning of the '80s was when the whole internal conflict in Peru started, when we had the insurgency of the Shining Path and the Mirta, and then '92 actually turned out to be very pivotal because that's when they caught the leader of the Shining Path. And then the internal conflict really, I mean, it kind of stayed, when they really say it ended, it was around 2000, even though by '92 it had, like, because of them catching it, it started to decline a bit, or phase out. But I kind of made this really conscious choice to set the book in the early, like, before they caught him. I think they caught him in September, and I was writing around August, excuse me. And I really wanted to do that because I wasn't, I was really more interested in what was happening to this one family when the wife is kidnapped, and they're already, like, they have this very frail marriage, and what happens to the family dynamics because of that. And there was, like, the terrorism and all that going on was definitely an important part of it, but there's very different things going on at the time, right? So everyone, like, a lot of people think, oh, so it was a terrorist that kidnapped her, and I was like, no, actually, there's a lot of organized crime going on at the time as well. And so I kind of really wanted to focus on one aspect of the fact that all of these things, they are related, but they're not necessarily, like, directly related. And the idea of this conflict really being the backdrop, and yet it does affect the characters in various ways, just not the ones you would expect. But does that answer the question?
Mm-hmm. Well, and Dan, so you joked that you said you don't have anything, you haven't written historical fiction, but, like, you've written a book about different figures in American sort of political history who went from the political left to the political right, and it's narrative driven. It's right. Like intuitively, because it's like the story of why they made that choice. What kind of research did you do? Because there was clearly, like, the politics of it, but so much of, like, their decision making was also very personal. Yeah. What kind of research did you do into, like, these public figures' personal lives?
Yeah, and that was false modesty. I believe I have something interesting to say about everything, including things I don't know anything about. So,
oh, you just ruined your false modesty.
Yeah, I just blew it out of the water. Yeah, I mean, I read a lot, and to your point about the characters, I think the thing that I read a lot, I did a little bit of interviewing, but really very little. I interviewed the two subjects who are still alive. Christopher Hitchens died while I was writing the book. I didn't interview him, which is a shame, but the other two who were and are still alive, I talked to them, but it wasn't a sort of primarily interview-based book. I think for me, the most important material was the stuff they'd written. And my method, to the extent that there is one, is really reading their own stuff as kind of text to mine, not just for sort of, and maybe even in a sense, not even primarily for what happened, but for what I perceive about their psychology. So it was really, and that was not always kind of on the surface. I mean, I had to grant myself a certain license, a quasi-fictional license to just kind of read into what they were saying, what I believe must be the case about their psychology. So, for instance, with one of the guys, James Burnham, who was Trotskyist in the 1930s and then became an anti-communist and editor of National Review. One of the things I write about was right after the Depression, so he was not on a path to becoming a political writer. He thought he was going to be a kind of a philosopher and a literary critic, a man of the arts and arts and letters and that sort of thing. And so he had founded a journal that was devoted to those things. And a few months after he found it, the stock market crashed and the Depression hit. So it sort of knocked everybody in the country for a loop. And he sort of resisted the pull of politics for as long as he could. And you're kind of tracking this in the journal. And I'm watching what he's writing, and he's not writing about politics. And as he continues not writing about politics, it seems increasingly odd, considering what was going on and what everyone around him, and he was an intellectual in New York, and what intellectuals in New York were talking about was politics and Marxism and all of these things, and it became kind of increasingly perverse. And the last article he wrote before just kind of breaking down and writing about politics, which would be his subject for the rest of his life, was about modern, or at the time, modern physics. And he was so angry at the physicists, at the quantum physicists, for their obscurity and the lack of accessibility in the language with which they talked about, quantum physics, of all things, right? And he was so angry, and as I basically said, this is not about physics. This is about somebody, among other things, who thought his life was going to be one thing and is kind of slowly realizing, but not quite consciously realizing, that it's not going to be about that thing, that it's going to be about something else, and he's going to have to deal with it. So that sort of thing, and sometimes it's much more direct than that, but that sort of thing was what I was looking for in trying to think about how to write about those people and characterize who they were and why they did what they did.
And that's really awfully important, the way you approach that, because if there's one way that you're guaranteed not to write a good book, that's to do the research and then write up your research. When you have to intuit somebody or follow an instinct about what is motivating them or where they're coming from, that's where the research meets the art.
Yeah.
And that's what you have to do, and you have to learn to trust your instincts.
What do you think is what is the appeal of these historical narratives? In straight history, if Ken Burns comes up with a documentary, everybody watches it. You're just sort of guaranteed built-in audience. And historical fiction as a genre is very popular, and novels that do the kinds of things I think you're doing in your new one, Natalia, where you go back and forth in time. That's a really sort of common literary novel device. What is the appeal? And in my own head, I came up with a couple of possibilities, and one is obviously in the past there were different sort of moral codes or political. Dan, I'm sure you mentioned Trotsky, right? Yeah. Nobody gets called a Trotskyite now except by a few people. When you were was part of the appeal of looking into these figures was understanding how they negotiated the politics that were different then that are not the same now? Was that how did you sort of understand a political sort of atmosphere that isn't really parallel to ours today?
Part of the appeal, I think, was just it was just the romance of it, and sort of and this is of course illusory, right? Because it probably for the most part didn't feel romantic to the people at the time. So it's reading about left-wing mostly what's one of the left-wing mostly Jewish students at City College in the late 1920s and 1930s, where they had the Trotskyist alcove in the cafeteria and the hardcore Communist Party alcove, and these fights that they would have in arguments about Marxism and modernity and civilization and capitalism, and which included all these people who of course they didn't know this at the time, but would go on to be seminal intellectuals and political actors in 20th century history. So imagining that, right, as compared to my frankly pretty mundane existence, was exciting, and I get to when I'm sort of reading about that stuff and thinking about it, and not trying to overly romanticize it, but I guess partaking in my writing of what I hope is some of the romance of it, even as I know that that's a little bit illusory. That's appealing.
You mentioned the word romance a couple of times, and Sherry, you've written romance. And when we think about period dramas, there's often a romantic element. And I mean, to look at, like, your book does not have sort of like the sort of like chest bursting.
Well, that's because it's a mystery.
But it does it's clear, like, from the cover, like, that this is like a novel in which, like, clothing is going, like her clothing is very distinctive. It marks her of the time. And that's part of the appeal of certain kinds of historical dramas, is like you get to, like, immerse yourself in the clothing and all the accessories of the time. And I wonder,
Well, it's like
is
the mists of London, right? And like the
Right.
smell of whatever the oil was
Sherlock
they
Holmes
burned.
is famous for that, right?
Right.
And so like, how much of that do you think I have to give that to my readers because they really want it? They want to sort of, like, see, like, the clothing and the dirty streets and and the mists.
I have to confess, first of all, that I am not personally a consumer of costume drama. Probably because I think awful things happen in them. Like, lots of awful things, and then everybody dies. Which is not the kind of story I'm interested in consuming, which is why I still haven't watched Downton Abbey, because I'm not sure whether they won't do that to me. The only historical drama I like is basically Pride and Prejudice. And that is, in some ways, house porn, I guess you can say, because there's Pemberley. So I do get why people think it's the clothes, it's the different times, it's the romance. But as a writer, that is not what's interesting about setting your stories in the past. You set it in the past, for me at least, is because the constraints are greater. The constraints on people's lives, especially on women's lives, are much greater. Every choice is fraught with consequences. You marry this person, you cannot get rid of them until they die. You know, that is consequence. That's high stakes for any action. And in fiction, you're always looking to up the stakes. That's stakes. And frankly, not having cell phone is a good thing in fiction. I believe right now in Hollywood movies, what they're desperately trying to do is, why can't we use a cell phone here? Like, first of all, you have to come up with reasons why cell phones need not apply. So back in history, automatically cell phones need not apply. You have all these constraints that make things simpler, like, you know, no forensic evidence is good for writing mystery, for crafting a pure mystery, rather than having to rely on the procedural. So those are the things that I like about history as a writer. Really not interested in history as a person.
You mentioned the constraint. Natalia, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say what you were saying reminds me, like, that tendency to kind of glorify the past, but then we kind of lack context when we do it. Because when I was little, I remember watching Gone with the Wind. I think I was 9, and I told my mom, I was like, I wish I could have lived back then. Those, you know, the dresses are so beautiful, and really all I thought about was Scarlett's dress. And she told me, she's like, I don't think you would have wanted to live back then. And I was like, why? She's like, well, we're Peruvian immigrants. I don't know what we would do in, you know, Civil War, in the Civil War South as Peruvian immigrants. And it was just kind of like, oh, it was like the first time that had even entered my mind. My mom was always grounding me in very real ways. But yeah, it's just, and I think actually that's what's really interesting about going back to history, is peeling away those layers of like glorifying it, and then adding that, like, all the things that would complicate and all the nuances that we tend to forget in hindsight.
Did you find that was the case with like your first book and the book that you have coming out? That did you find that there were constraints, or that were things you had to peel away that you didn't previously know?
Oh yeah, there were so. I mean, actually, I learned so much, especially with writing Chasing the Sun. The first time I tried to write it was a complete failure, and it was because I was just I hadn't done a lot of research. I really was like, well, I was born there, I can write this, and it was like, no, actually, you really can't. You never lived there. You don't know what life was like there, but it really became about, well, what do I know, and how do I use it as a jumping off point to realize what I don't? And so kind of trying to fill in those gaps. And so it was just, and it was a lot of, yeah, you know, reading newspapers, reading books, you know, like I mentioned before, reading, like, watching all these documentaries. And what I found was actually that research just helped complicate my plot even more every time, and in the best possible ways. One of the things that I thought was really interesting, especially because I started creating this timeline. So where would my characters be at these points in time? And at the time that my characters had gotten married, some years back, there was actually, like, the government had started trying to privatize all these different industries. And one of the ones they started trying to privatize was the newspaper, or, you know, basically journalism, although not just newspaper, but the media. And my character when he got married, he was like next in line to inherit his father's newspaper. So like it was just, okay, well, what kind of panic would that, you know, set off? And this, not just in this whole country, but in this particular family, and just it's definitely like you look at things that are macro, you know, you look at things and then you kind of just keep going like deeper and deeper. And so it's like at the micro level, like how is this different for every person? How are they affected differently?
Yeah, Michael, I think it's one thing that we ought to be able to convey to a room full of writers, as far as costume drama goes, is that everything you write, especially in fiction, has to serve the story. And you can't just show off, you know, what all you learned about something, because then you go down a bunny trail and, you know, it has to serve the story. The first of the Putnam novels, it's about the Barbary Pirate War, which is, you know, the Marines invade North Africa for the first time, the shores of Tripoli, right? Well, come to find that there was an ancient city right there at Derna, which in ancient times is called Cyrene. James of Cyrene in the Bible is from there. But their whole economy was based on this kind of onion, which in ancient days everybody wanted because it was considered to be both an aphrodisiac, so guys could take it and have a good time, but it was also an abortifacient, so women could take it and not risk getting pregnant. And so the Egyptians bought it, Phoenicians bought it, Greeks bought it. In Rome, it was worth its weight in silver, and their economy dried up and blew away because they picked it all. It went extinct. Okay, that's wonderful, but how does it serve the story? You know, you can't just hold court and give it, especially these days when nobody is going to allow you a 1,200-page Michener exposition where you start with dinosaurs and you can explore every piece of botany that you learn. Those days are gone, you know. So if you've got to be able to, plus, what would your character know about it? If it's an Arab character, he wouldn't know that its Latin name was Silphium Actrictus or whatever, you know. The story's the thing, and everything has to serve the story.
I wanted to ask you too about sort of the appeal, especially like, so you're now doing like what you call tall ship drama.
Ship adventures, yeah.
And you know, I just showed my kids the first sort of Pirates of the Caribbean movie, and they were smitten, and they all dressed as Captain Jack Sparrow for Halloween, and the appeal, I mean, it's so cool, and you automatically, they were imagining themselves onto the ship, and that seems to be a part of like historical drama, at least, especially like history that's set, you know, far enough in the past that you don't know anybody who was actually like living them, that you get to imagine yourself there, but also not have to be there, because being on a ship was pretty terrible, and like being a woman in these particular times is pretty difficult. And I wonder, like, to some extent, are you giving your readers sort of this like vicarious living experience where like we get to live through these adventures, but also like they have to know like it's safe, like you don't actually have to like get
but see, that's the joy of writing fiction, is that you, like Jack Sparrow, you can write it tongue in cheek, you can write it very seriously. There's all different ways to do it. I mean, you can just tell your story and then put costumes on people, and that will get you, say, to Braveheart. You know, interesting movie, nothing in there really happened. Yeah, but a story is so powerful that Braveheart almost single-handedly reignited the Scottish independence movement, even though nothing in there really happened, or not like that, right? Or you can dramatize the real history and have all this factual stuff and maybe invent a couple of conversations, which isn't all that interesting. There's all different ways to do it. You know, and I wouldn't discount Pirates of the Caribbean at all, because it's fun. Mm-hmm. Fun is good.
Oh, it's all that's going on in my house right now.
I mean, there's also I mean, it's also like, I mean, there's the fact there's this thing when we talk about genre, but we talk about genre as a kind of publishing fact, right? There's this thing, historical fiction, right? And that's not, the genre that I've consumed a lot of is science fiction, fantasy, right? And so you have to draw a distinction between just sort of conceptually, what does it mean to write historical fiction, or what does it mean to write science fiction and fantasy, and the genre and what that means, right? And so I probably read, I read hundreds of these things, right? And there's a formula, right? And there is that escapism that you're talking about. It's not in the past. It's it's either in an imagined past or it's in the future. Absolutely. As a reader, not as a writer of science fiction, but as a reader, past and present of science fiction and fantasy. No question like that. Exactly what you said, being able to go into this space that is exciting and romantic and dangerous, but from the safety of your own bedroom. And also, I think, probably a particular appeal and potency, within the our sort of modern existence, in which we're on a planet of 8 billion, and we know of the existence of all of them, and we feel like our individual decisions often don't matter that much in the grand sweep of things in our lives. They might have personal meaning, but they don't have sort of historical, to read, and again, I'm talking about the stuff I read, but to read a story about somebody who saves the galaxy from evil aliens, or destroys the, Dark Lord Sauron, or something like that, and that vicarious sense of meaning and purpose. So again, I don't want to speak for the writers of it, but as a reader of genre fiction, there's no question that is a big part of what's happening.
How did you find the tone with which you were going to treat your version of the character?
I think from a writer's point of view, a story sets its own tone. It very much depends on your characters. And the freeing thing is that there is such a huge body of Sherlock Holmes pastiche, and which started basically from Conan Doyle's own day. Other people were writing Sherlock Holmes stories, that it really runs the whole gamut. So no matter where your particular story fall, it's been done before. Funny, been done before. Serious, been done before. Basically, all kind of extrapolation have done before. So I felt quite free in just letting my story set its own tone. The woman who is my Sherlock Holmes is a fallen woman. So she's in certain difficulties, but her personality is in some ways buoyant, I guess. She loves fashion, and she loves food. And so in some sense, though she is in difficulty, there's an underlying zest for life that is there, and she's also slightly on the spectrum. So she speaks very bluntly, which shocks a lot of people sometimes, especially back then. So I remember when my agent sent it to her Hollywood agent to see whether he would be interested in shopping this, he first wasn't too sure, but then he read it and he thought he liked the touch of humor throughout. So that made him more interested in it. And I didn't even think it was a funny book, but like I said, the book sets its own tone.
Natalia, how about you? So you mentioned in Chasing the Sun that people would assume the kidnappers are going to be it'll be part of the Shining Path, it'll be part of, and you're like, well, no, it's not. I'm going to sort of dig into a different thing that was going on at that time, which then affects the tone, because
Right.
if it's not that, if it's this, well, there's a sort of a different take on it. And did you have to did you always know sort of the voice that was going to carry you through the book, or did you have to find it? You said the first time you wrote it was a failure.
Well, yeah, it was, because I agree, it definitely is the characters that set that tone. But the first time I wrote it as a linked set of short stories, and so each short story was told from a different character's point of view. And I started from, I think, the daughter's point of view, and then it was the maid that lived in the family's home, and then it was the son, then the wife, and at the very end was the husband. And it wasn't until I got to those last two that I realized that they were having this troubled marriage. And so from then on, I focused it just on them. And for me, it just ended up being having to find the real story, kind of that idea of there's a story behind the story and another story behind that, and where's the real heart of this. And one of the when I was in college, my advisor, my mentor had told me, she's like, fiction or any story you're writing, you think it's one story, but then what's the thing that you say, well, and then on top of that, I was dealing with this. You know, and so that's kind of what I was trying to think about. It's not just that it's a kidnapping. It's like on top of that, they're just like they're going through all this conflict in their own marriage. And so yeah, it definitely it affected the tone because so much of the book is about waiting, because he has to just wait for the kidnappers to call and everything. So it gave it, like, it was very somber. It was very much what I was very surprised with was when they marketed the book. They marketed it as literary suspense and domestic drama. So I was just kind of like, okay, cool. Like, I mean, I didn't know that, but that's cool that it was. But and then in my next book, like my next book deals so much with death, and yet the character there's this one character who's a spirit, and he makes me laugh. So it was really interesting to kind of navigate that. And he brought some much needed levity to the narrative.
Dan, in your book, speaking of tone and like ideas of like characters sort of like creating the tone, several of the guys that you write about are pretty miserable human beings. Like you wouldn't want to, like, they're not the sort of people you're like, I would love to go hang out with that guy. They failed that test. And yet, like, the way you write about them is really pretty sympathetic. Like, you don't often take like a caustic tone toward them, even when they're being pretty awful. And I wonder, like, how did you find the tone with which you were going to treat these individuals?
Let me think about that. I mean, I guess the first thing I would say is and this is maybe one of the reasons why I'm not a fiction writer, but I mean, the tone in a sense all just sounds like me. And maybe I have a few different registers, but there's not a lot of, maybe I have a few different registers of me that I can write in, and maybe, and I think sometimes there were certain aspects of the language that started to echo the writing, because as I said, I was so engaged in their own writing that started to echo their own sort of rhythms or cadences, but I'm not sure about that, but that might be the case. It was not, I mean, I agree, like some of the people I wrote about, are pretty grotesque, and I mean, there was somebody forwarded me a tweet, one of the guys I wrote about, David Horowitz, just tweeted, just one of these absurd, he was writing about the Roy Moore situation, and it was just one of these, like, yeah, he probably did it, but like, the Democrats are worse, and just like one of these kind of gross tweets, and he's done a lot of things that are pretty gross. Blessing and a curse of my temperament is that I'm not, at least about those sorts of things, I'm not easily offended. It's pretty easy for me to slip into a place where I'm just kind of, at least in a sort of intellectual way, just kind of empathizing with them and not worrying too much about projecting what my moral judgment would be in another context. I mean, I wish I had something more interesting to say. I'm fortunate, at least for the type of thing that I write about, that's not something that's hard for me. But I think it'd be something, that would be hard for a lot of people. And in fact, you see over and over again, I think in ways that are actually really pretty toxic to people's writing when they're trying to write about people like this and say something interesting. Either it's their own moral condemnation that comes through, or even worse, it's their fear that if they don't express the proper amount of moral condemnation, then they're going to be judged by their peers, which is just a terrible reason to write a sentence or something like that. But I see that particularly with the type of people I write about. I see that all the time.
And Jim, sort of a slightly different question, because I want to come back to something you were saying earlier about the pumpkin pies and the pencils. And this has to do with research, which we've been talking about throughout. One of the things I heard a writer say one time was that you should do research, but you should also research as you write, so that when you come to a thing that you don't know, then you go look it up. And so you looked up, pumpkin pie, you looked up pencils. Do you have like places that you go to? You're like, if I have to figure out like what kinds of food people ate, clothing they wore, like what they carried on themselves, like what kind of money or whatever, like pencils. How do you go about it? Are there a couple places that you're like, I know I can go there and find that kind of information, or is it like a brand new invention of research every time that you have to look something up?
Yes and yes. I mean, for language, and a good online etymological dictionary is indispensable. in writing historical fiction, my characters can't say okay until 1840, and then maybe only sparingly. So the online etymological dictionary. There are all kinds of websites about period cooking and recipes. They're just fascinating to watch. Lots of lectures, which, you know, anybody who lectures has a point of view that you need to be a bit apprehensive about. Actually, my job gets easier when I was very young. I was writing my first novel, which was a historical novel, and I had no idea what I was doing. I had done 4 nonfiction books for Doubleday, and my editor said, well, you know, I do our Western series, and you're a pretty good writer. I think you can do fiction, so here's a little contract. Go learn how to write a novel. That doesn't happen anymore. But I had no idea what I was doing, and I talked to David Lindsay, who did the Stu Hayden mysteries for Doubleday and Athenaeum. We were friends. And I said, David, how do you do it? I mean, I'm totally lost. And he said, well, Jim, I don't write my novels. My characters write my novels for me. Thanks a lot. You know, that's just so helpful. He said, no, really, get yourself out of the way, put them on a page, and just let them extemporize like in a movie. Let them play on each other like in a movie. And the first time I did that, and I got it 10 pages later, and it was like lightning had struck, I thought, okay, I need to be more careful about how much of my narrative I put into it. For one thing, you have to give people enough a reader enough to go on, but you can't give him or her so much that you interfere with his mind's eye, her mind's eye, completing a scene, because it's an interactive kind of thing. And for me, the hardest thing about writing fiction is to know when to shut up and let the readers take over and their imaginations take over. Because if we're producing art, it's like a painting or anything else. That art has got to strike everybody differently and go to where they are. And so it's quite possible to tell too much.
Are there any, for the rest of you, are there any other resources that you go back to, like places to find information, whether it's about politics or...
For words, Oxford English Dictionary, the online version, the Austin Public Library used to have access to it, and that was wonderful. I consulted it all the time. They don't anymore. I wrote them a letter begging for it to reinstate it. But right now, my mother works for Southwestern University. And they have access to it. So I am using her logon to do my word checking to make sure that word existed at the time and was used in the sense that I wanted to use. So that Oxford English Dictionary, if you can afford a copy of your own for writing historical fiction, it's great because they source everything. And for things like clothes, if you want to write in the 19th century, there's a book called A Handbook of English Women's Costume in the 19th Century, or that's there about the title. The author is Willett, either Cunnington or Cunningham, I'm not quite sure, but I have that at home, and it's encyclopedic in how detailed it is. Goes decade by decade, and then year by year breakdown. Hats, clothes, underclothes, everything. And if you want something like, see, what else would people be interested in? Clothes, words, food. Okay, food. If you are a Victorian, if you're writing the Victorian times, the BBC has done 2 very interesting series. One is called the Victorian Kitchen, and the other is called the Victorian Kitchen Garden, in which they actually recreated from by finding like really old people who had actually worked in those big giant country manors, in those kitchens and in those kitchen gardens, and by going through like their old sources. And then they also wrote companion books to these TV series, both of which I have. So one is called The Victorian Kitchen, the other called The Victorian Kitchen Garden, both very, very useful. What else would people need? Clothes, food?
Can I ask a question
Yeah.
about language of the past? Because my assumption is, but maybe this is wrong, that you're not actually trying to perfectly recreate the way that, although I know this is sometimes the case, but you're not necessarily trying to perfectly recreate the way that people spoke in a given time. you're trying to sort of evoke it. You know, like in the way in the movies when there's like in American movies when there's like German characters, they're not actually speaking German, they just speak in a sort of pronounced German accent. But I mean, genuinely that's a question. So on the one hand, there's things you don't want to get wrong, like saying okay before okay was sort of common idiom. But are you actually trying to write dialogue like people in that time spoke?
Actually, I come at it, the tone that we take, since you asked, to me is just one element of deciding how to write your book, what time period, what subject, and so on, because we really have the freedom to choose. When I began working on Putnam's Navy series, I decided that we're going to steer these stories as close to actual facts as a good story will bear. Because and literacy is a big kick of mine right now, because when you think about out there, 32 million adults in this country can't read. Another 45 million can't read above a 4th grade level. Half of us can't read above an 8th grade level. We vote, but we can't read. And that's just being able to read. Historical literacy, forget it. I mean, you ask people who's the only country to ever drop atomic weapons in warfare, half of them can't say the United States. And when you say what president did it, a third of them say Ronald Reagan. You know, so to me, okay, I'll give people a good story, but by God, when they're through with it, they're going to learn some history. Now, that is not the only way to write a historical novel, but since if you read the classic Navy stories, whether it's Hornblower or Master and Commander, those series, 80% of the word length is pulling ropes and sailing the ships, which nobody understands anymore. And so we dialed that back 70% and replaced it with social history, learning that in New England in 1800, people did not celebrate Christmas. They were Congregationalists. They thought Christmas was popish. They thought, you know, George Washington spends 3 days celebrating Christmas down at Mount Vernon, but that's because he's Southern, you know. So there's a lot of history in there, only because that's the way we designed this particular series.
Mm-hmm. Well, what about language in particular, where like is it in the language and the word has escaped my head, but like when things are out of time, with
Anachronism.
Thank you, anachronism. Can you get away with it at all? I mean, certainly like Hamilton is the most popular thing on the planet, and like the language that they are using is clearly like of this time and not Hamilton's time. So I wonder, like in terms of the time that you're writing, or like the place, the particular like slang and language and sort of idioms of the place, how accurate do you have to get it?
One of my favorite historical mysteries is by, I think, Ariana Franklin, the Mistress of the Art of Death. And that is set in like the 1100 or 1200. And when was Chaucer?
I mean, in that vicinity.
Right. And the thing I remember from high school English about Chaucer is I had no idea what he was saying. In fact, I cannot read Shakespeare because I'm like, don't know what you're saying either.
Right.
So English way back then, you cannot possibly do it like that. Mm-hmm. So she used a fairly modern vernacular, and it worked very well because the history was there. The history, the constraints, the kind of murders that were committed, the social context was all there. So you didn't really care about the language. The language was fine. And the king threw around a lot of F words, and that was totally fine because the F word actually existed back then. Yep. But I think for us writing in the 19th century, you can still read Pride and Prejudice without any problem. And mainly what I do is use a slightly like higher level of diction. And, you know, if I feel like throwing a big word, I don't mind. Other than that, there's not that much constraint.
I think readers also give us a lot of credit because in my Navy series, there's a lot of need for a translator. Like if you're in the court of the Emperor of Morocco, and we've got American naval officers standing there in front of him and his whole divan of advisors, and there's a translator. If you just say the translator said this, or the emperor leaned over and said to him, and then you can continue in English, and people understand that this isn't actually being said in English. But when you're, like you said, when you're as recent as the 19th century, you don't really need to jump through the hoops that you do with Chaucer. You're right, that would be very difficult to do accurately. It would get in the way.
Natalia, what about you? You were...
No, I've read, I think that when it's done right, like, if you are going to use those why can't I get this word? How is it?
I ruined it for
Okay.
you. It's all my fault.
I think it helps like serve as a mirror, like helping to transport the reader, because if everything else is completely, different time, different place, and like for me, when I read it, it just helps me just feel more like I can relate to it.
Because you're familiar with the language and you
Right.
understand.
Yeah, and you're still like you said, you're getting all the other details right. You're hopefully getting to like the different levels of truth, which is like, emotional, contextual, and all those things. And I also wanted to add, just really quickly, going back to when you're saying different sources. I know that we talk a lot about like, the internet being amazing for this, and even just reading and watching or films or anything. But one of the things that I found, and I continually find the most revealing when I'm in that research phase, and if not everyone can do it, but if you have the means to like interview people,
Yep.
really don't shy away from that. Like when you talk to someone, there are things that you will learn that you won't find in a book. Whether it's someone who has lived in the time period that you're wanting to explore, whether it's someone who is a scholar of that time period, whether it's someone who maybe worked in a certain job capacity as someone, there's just the kind of things you can learn from that person, often not even from the questions you thought you had. There's just really nothing quite like that. And for me, every time like I've done that is really where I get to the heart of the most rich like information.
So the question that we like to end on it's an easy one. What can we look forward to from you next? Like, what's the book that you're working on, or what's the thing that we're going to see from you next? Sherry, do you want to begin?
Yes, I'm doing Nano on book 3 in the Lady Sherlock series, and as soon as I'm done with that, I have to get into. I am writing a YA adaptation of the Ballad of Mulan, which this publisher approached me. I'm not writing it for Disney, unfortunately, but because Mulan is old property, and they wanted someone. They said, oh, there's never been a YA adaptation of it. So they said, are you interested in writing it? And at that point, I hadn't seen Mulan in 20 years, and I was like, hold on a second. I may not have seen it much, but it's like if you take out that little dragon, if you take out all the song and dance sequences, are you sure you guys want a YA adaptation, which is an 80,000 word novel and not a chapter book? They say, yes, we want YA. Then I was like, okay, then we'll have to do like a whole, from the ground reimagining. So will be the next thing I tackle.
Wow, that sounds amazing. My next book comes out in March. It's called Everyone Knows You Go Home, and it's set in McAllen. It's a story about a man and a woman who are married on the Day of the Dead. And on their wedding day, they're visited by the spirit of the estranged father-in-law of the family. And so nobody will talk to him except for Isabel, who just married into this family. And he ends up visiting every Day of the Dead, every anniversary of their marriage. And in the meantime, the newlyweds end up, their nephew ends up crossing the border from Mexico into Texas and needing a home. So she's trying to find out why these two crossings, like this spiritual crossing and this physical crossing, how they're both linked. And so that's where I'm at right now.
So this is the fantasy next book that I'm writing, because between my 3 kids and my full-time job, I'm probably not going to be writing another book for a while. But this is the one, if somehow, miraculously, the time emerges for me to write a book, I've been really thinking about writing something that in my head is called The White Man's James Baldwin. And it's about race. It's my take on race, black, white, all the above race in America.
That is a title that'll get people's attention, I think.
Really? When Shores of Tripoli came out, I actually got a book tour, which is very surprising. nobody gets a tour anymore. But I was in a brew pub in a small town in Connecticut giving a book talk, and an elderly lady raised her hand, and she said, well, I'm concerned, how long is this series going to be? I want to know how it ends, and I'm getting on up there. So book 3, I've got to do one a year. So The Devil in Paradise will come out next November. Sometime next year will be the Handy Texas Answers book, because before Putnam came along and I was desperate for money, the Handy Answers publisher came along. They do Handy Answers books on astronomy or the Civil War or English grammar or whatever, and they wanted to start with states. And it was a whole lot of money for not a whole lot of work for not a lot of money. And as you saw me slaving on it downstairs, it's every waking moment when I'm not working on Putnam, or also doing one a year of juvenile Texas history for the state bar. So I'm occupied.
Before we thank our panelists, take a look over there because there are their books. Buy their books. They're all really interesting, as you've seen. Now, please thank our panelists for being here tonight.
This has been the Writers League of Texas podcast. For more information about the Writers League of Texas and our many programs and services for writers, visit our website at writersleague.org. Email us at wlt@writersleague.org or give us a call at 512-499-8914. Thank you for listening.